Welcome back again. You look refreshed, arms and legs stretched. Hopefully you had a nice lunch and a nice conversation in preparation of the second half of this day of this conference. Very good to see you again. The next panel discussion looks at how high-minded principles and standards are or are not put in practice and why. We've discussed some of that already in the morning, touching upon some points, talking points that deserve more unpacking. There was the European Commission's Media Freedom Act, proposed very recently, as mentioned already earlier this morning, and then there are the standards put forward by the Council of Europe. Principles of the utmost importance in democratic societies, but they remain words, 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 if they are not solidified in the day-to-day work of journalists and media outlets, in particular of the public service media. This means, in concrete, in terms of their financing and governments, making sure they can operate independently and are free to speak, investigate, and hold to account. To lead the discussion, it's my pleasure and honor to introduce to you Živile Kropaitė, journalist at LRT. Živile, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Annelies. Thank you. Congratulations, everybody. I followed the discussion and I think you had a really productive and successful morning. A lot of content. You had public service media being compared to ambulance, and you have also had this reiteration of the idea that events like war prove the significance of public broadcasting. Public media outlets themselves do start putting extra effort in fulfilling their remits. But as it has also been said, regardless of the geopolitics of the events, the public service media does constantly experience pressures. And it's not just Hungary and Poland, not just the Eastern European countries that we always like to talk about as problematic in that regard. It's also Western European countries that do experience pressures, funding, threats to the funding to be abolished, and different ways by parties and politicians to interfere as well. So our aim today is to discuss the challenges that matter to us all. We will talk about best examples and case studies from different countries. We'll touch upon remit, funding and governance of public service media and market environment in which they operate. And we will do that in the context of Council of Europe standards, and we will see how they are obeyed, how they are implemented or not implemented. There's a great hybrid actually panel because we will have some speakers joining us online here with us today, and let me introduce all of them to you. There, furthest away from me, you can see Head of ODIHR Election Department, Megan Fitzgerald. Thank you for joining us. Right beside her is Christina Rozgoni, who is Senior Scientist at the Institute for Comparative Media and Communication Studies at Austrian Academy of Sciences. Thank you so much. Next to her is Professor at the University of Fribourg's Department of Communication and Media Research, and that's Manuel Pupis. Thank you so much. Also with us is General Rapporteur of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, Mogens Jensen. Good afternoon. And also Chairman of the Cultural Committee of the same as the Lithuanian Parliament, Vytautas Juozapaitis. Thank you for being here despite the budgetary procedures that are currently going on in this very same building happening right now. Those watching us online, you will have a chance to ask your questions on Zoom if you are watching us online. If you're here though, there will be a chance to ask your questions at the end. You will be able to raise your hand and discuss and address the issues that are of concern to you. So please be aware of that. There will be time allocated specifically for your questions. We would be really happy to see what matters to you and what are the topics that you want to dwell on. Right before this conference, I talked to the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie. I asked him what he thought were the most problematic, the main challenges public service broadcasting is experiencing today. And we began by talking about the license fee in the UK. Please have a look.
The specific license fee mechanic. It's, are you fully independent and impartial of political influence? Just to be clear, there's no future for the BBC in my mind where we are entangled to editorially in terms of how we can report where we're not fully independent and impartial. That's principle number one. The second is, I do think that we are about universal broadcasting. That means making content for everyone, not for a few. So whatever funding mechanic we get, wherever we end up, and we've had issued very clear principles. It needs to be fair, it needs to protect universality, it needs to protect independence. To me, the exact way in which a fee is collected can be debated over time.
So you don't think that independence is impossible if the license fee is cracked?
No, it depends on the mechanic, the charter, and we are enshrined in a charter to 27, 28. The big challenge for public service broadcasters is not political. It's in a world in which there is infinite competition on the internet, are we delivering enough value to every household? The big number in the BBC is 90% of people use it every week. That is our obsession. That's what we need to focus on. The rest is secondary.
But what are the main obstructions in terms of providing, as you say, enough value for every household?
Well, the main challenge, of course, is when I was growing up, we had 2 out of 4 TV channels and a lot of the radio frequency. So, this audience will know the internet strips away distribution advantage. So the challenge, of course, is relevance. Are we relevant? Is our content going to cut through? Is it exciting enough? Is it interesting enough that it's not just there like as a kind of, I don't know, a kind of a good thing that not many people use, but is kind of good for society? I'm not interested in building that. What I want to do and see is for public service broadcasting is we are loved and used by the vast, vast majority of people. And to do that in a world in which you don't have the right to have 2 out of 4 TV channels, you have to be focused on your content. Have you got the right programming? Are you investing in the right events? All those things editorially. And by the way, you will never beat Netflix. You'll never beat TikTok on their own terms, or Spotify. You need to do things differently. And we think British storytelling, high quality news, international coverage, UK sports events, coverage of the Queen's funeral, all these things we can do in a way that others can't. That's not what Netflix are doing. Netflix aren't doing local news. We are.
You have mentioned the Queen's funeral, and we do turn to public service broadcasting when things like war begin, when things like Queen's funeral begin. Do you think the Queen's funeral, which you covered extensively, do you think that sort of fixed some things in reputation?
The trust levels for the BBC are pretty high, but we're kind of paranoid about keeping them high. And by the way, this is all about trust. And when we think about our output, there's, I think, a couple of things that build trust. Do people really understand our agenda, which is fighting for the truth? And the second thing is, are we doing things in extremely high quality, beautifully delivered, flawlessly executed, so that no one in the world can touch us? And when we had the privilege of broadcasting coverage of the Queen's death and funeral and that period, that is when a public service broadcaster gets tested. And we absolutely, we've rehearsed it, we were prepared, and I think we delivered it flawlessly. And that makes me very proud. And it was important in terms of how audiences perceive the BBC. The other thing I'd say about events like this, and we have had a lot over the summer, and we're looking forward to, from an EBU perspective, Eurovision, we've got a coronation coming. Of course, we've got the World Cup over the next few weeks. I think in a world where media is so fragmented and polarised and everyone can be in their own little world, curiously, I think those moments when a country comes together or when a community comes together across class, across political opinions, then people absolutely are hungry to celebrate things or remember things together. And one thing public service broadcasters can do is they can be, in a world where free speech is under attack, democracy is under attack, we can be a place where people come together, they share views, they share experiences, and we bring people together. We're important.
You keep mentioning people, quality, excitement, content. But if you did have to make one amendment in terms of governance, what would it be?
Governance is not the big issue for the BBC at this point. We have a good functioning board, a regulator in Ofcom. I haven't got an issue. I mean, I think one of the things I do think is we are lucky to have an 11-year charter. And one thing I would say in history is we do need to make sure we have long-term certainty. If you're going to transition to digital, you're going to need long-term settlements and stability. So in some ways, the one thing I would recommend on governance is not to change much on governance, because you need stability.
100 years anniversary, you have mentioned this yourself and you have sort of answered the question already, but 100 years on, why do people still need public service broadcasting?
If you go back to the original days, and by the way, we're just about right, I'm looking at my watch because we're only, days away from the moment that, Lord Reith, who I'm the 17th Director General, he was number one, formed the BBC, and they were broadcasting from one radio station. And interestingly, they chose this very simple thing, which they could have been there making money on selling radios, but they decided they were going to do something for the public good, for the good of the nation. It's an amazing decision, by the way, amazing. It's so inspiring. And if I look at the state of the world today, I think there's never been a time where you need to find where truth is. You need your local storytelling, and you need to be connected to broadcasting of immense quality. And public service broadcasters, I think, play a unique role in this. What they need to do is innovate furiously so that the delivery mechanisms are not just traditional radio or linear television. They are you're a digital company, you are funding technology, you are partnering, you are rethinking how a news bulletin will look. So don't read this as it's all going to stay the same. We are radically changing the BBC in how it operates, how we make stuff, the form of how we make it, how we deliver it. But the values of trust, somewhere I can go, where the editorial values trump commercial return. We are not here to make money as our primary purpose. We are here to do good. That is still as relevant as it's ever been.
That was Tim Davie, Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, and an interview with him. One other participant of the discussion will be joining us online. I don't know if we can say hello to her, but she is from the UK as well, so I will mention her now, and that will be Vice Chair of the European Platform of Regulatory Authorities, Maria Dundee. She's also Head of International Content Policy at Ofcom. I think we can see you in a little screen. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining as well. Thank you. Morgens, the things we have just heard, people are hungry to celebrate things together. This is where public broadcasting may come in. No need for change in terms of governance, at least the UK is saying that now. You have a long-standing experience in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. What would you say are the main challenges currently that the public service media is discussing over the last few years?
Thank you very much for having me here. It's been wonderful to hear the discussion this morning, and I'm happy to participate here as well. And I just want to say that I totally agree with everything that was said by Tim Davie, because I think it is important that public service is for all. In some countries, it's for a little intelligentsia, and that's not enough. If we should finance public service, then it has to be for all of us. Of course, living up to the standards of enlightening people, of taking into consideration the different political streams in a society and so on. But it has to be for all, and it only has relevance if it is for all. But even though that in the United Kingdom there's at this stage not perhaps a discussion on governance, it's a problem other places. I would say if you look solely on public service, I think there are two main challenges that we see. Firstly, about decrease in funding of public service institutions. You also touched about this morning in Slovenia, but other places we also see a decrease in the funding. There's been a research done where you can see that in 19 and 20, 2019 and 20, it has decreased with 66% in average. And of course, that is a huge problem, especially in a situation where you have to invest more in public service in order to digitalize the service and follow the streams of the consumers.
And the issue with that is that a lot of times the digital activities of the media outlets are not financed as well as radio and television, right?
Exactly, and that's why it demands a lot of investment, and you still have to have the production facilities for producing linear television and radio, but you also now have to have the investments in order to digitalize it. So you have to ride on two horses at the same time, and that's not possible when you then decrease your budget. So that's one problem. And some places it's because you need money that you cut in public service. Other places it's because government wants to limit public service, or political parties want to limit public service, and that's the other, I would say, challenge we stand for when we talk about public service. It is that in a number of countries you also have populist political parties who want to limit public service because they don't share the way that the public service media are working, or think it's a threat to them as political parties.
Okay, let us stop here then, because we have said enough about funding. I think at this point, limit public service. There's attempts from populist governments. There's also cuts in budgets, as you say. Manuel, you have done research on public service media funding. Some countries are abolishing the license fee. There is France. Some are under huge discussions to abolish or to leave the license fee, the UK as well. Others are pressured to do so. Is it really, would you say, just the mechanics or the mechanic of funding, as Tim Davie put it, or is there an interdependence between independence and the model of funding that the public broadcaster has?
I guess there is an interdependence between the model of funding and independence. I mean, the traditional model, at least in Western Europe, has been the license fee. So you own a radio or TV set, you pay. And this had several advantages. One of them was that there was a direct relationship between license fee payers and the public broadcaster. And the other that was somehow detached from the state, so it gave more independence than funding from the state budget. But obviously today we can watch videos and listen to audio files, not only if we own a radio and TV set, so the license fee reaches its limits in a way, and we have now different options what to do, right? Either we extend the license fee to ever more devices, or we abolish it and replace it with state budget funding, or we come up with new models. And in our research, we see that a lot of countries in Europe still rely on the license fee, but there are reforms going on. And
would you name a country or two when you say new models are coming up? What are the newest really working models that would not necessarily be a license fee, but something else that works and maybe others could learn from that?
Well, perhaps one thing that also happens, and I'm not so sure it works, is moving to the state budget funding. We see this in the Flemish and French communities of Belgium, the Netherlands, Spain, and more recently Norway and Denmark. And this raises really concerns in academic circles that this gives politicians, gives parliaments more possibilities to take influence on the level of funding when they're not happy with coverage. So many countries try to move to different models. We see an individual public service media tax that has been introduced in Finland or Sweden. So it's income dependent, it's collected with regular taxes, but it's going into a specific fund, it's earmarked, so it goes only to public service media. And the other new model that is emerging right now is a broadcasting fee or broadcasting levy, meaning that not only households and organizations that own a radio or TV set, but all households and organizations contribute. We have this so far in Germany and Switzerland. In Austria, they are discussing it. We have discussions in the UK what the future will be.
And that's despite the devices that you have at home. You can have 0 devices, you can have 100 devices, and it doesn't matter, you would pay the fee anyway, right?
Exactly. And I mean, these new models are thought, like the license fee, to protect the independence of public service media better than funding from the state budget does. However, whether there is influence exerted, or at least governments and parliaments try to exert influence, is also a question of political culture. So it's irrespective of the funding model, somebody has to set the level of the fee or of the state tax that goes to broadcasting. So it's necessary to also think about mechanisms and instruments to implement to strengthen independence, for instance, by binding the fee to inflation, or by having independent expert committees that advise government on what they should do here.
Let's move now to Maria, because she is in the UK, and we have sort of started talking about the license fee, and there is a huge discussion in the UK on that, even though it sounded from the interview like, you know, it doesn't really matter what kind of mechanic we choose, as long as we get the funding and as long as we are independent, it's fine. But the actual discussions in the UK are huge. Would you maybe get us introduced to that a little?
Hello, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference today. I'm very, very sorry that I can't be there in person, and I'm here, as many of you may know, replacing the previous chair of EPRA, Lubos Kuklis, who was very sorry not to be here anymore, because unfortunately he had to stand down from his role recently. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you to Lubos and for suggesting me in his place, and that I'm very happy to take that role. So you're right, I am joining you indeed from the UK. If I can, I just wanted to say a couple of words just generally across the regulatory landscape, and then I'll touch on the UK situation. The role of the organisation that I represent, EPRA, is one of sharing best practice and of discussing and debating these issues amongst regulators. And our membership is extremely wide. It maps more or less across the Council of Europe, EBU space, indeed. And we generally have, I think, a sort of a split of competencies across our members in relation to public service broadcasting. So there is very, very rare cases where some of our members have no responsibilities, but in general, it's about a half and half split where regulators oversee some sort of limited aspects of the legal provisions around broadcasters in general. And then there are those who concentrate, like Ofcom does, on monitoring and assessing the public service broadcasters' performance. There are a number of different other roles that the regulators play. I'm going to some of those in a bit more detail. But I think one of the key aspects, and one of the kind of common aspects across any kind of regulatory oversight, is that of legitimacy. And I think Tim also touched on this to some extent, and Manuel has also, I think, raised that issue in relation to financing, actually, because if everybody pays and everybody should benefit, then there has to be some kind of connection between the payments that people make and the benefits that they get from that public service broadcaster. Where regulation can play a role is to offer that kind of independent oversight, accountability, which, you know, in an ideal framework should offer that kind of legitimacy and raise levels of trust and engagement with public service broadcasting. In relation to the questions of funding in particular, we absolutely do agree that there are challenges coming and challenges already in terms of the kind of funding that public service broadcasters are receiving. Interestingly, some of our members have more active roles than others in relation to funding. So it's very rare for regulators to actually be in a position to make any kind of judgment on how much a public service broadcaster should receive. But certainly many of our members, again, including Ofcom, but for example, the BAI of Ireland and others, have made public statements and public comments about the nature of the challenges facing PSBs, including financial, and have indeed made those types of comments. And so in the UK, Ofcom has also reflected on these issues and has not so much made recommendations to government about how to fund the BBC, but certainly outlined the kinds of challenges and the kinds of direction that would be beneficial.
But when you say some of our members are more active than others, would you maybe name some specific examples here?
So I think probably that one of the chief examples would be the Regulatory Authority of Ireland, the BAI, which has made repeated recommendations for changes in the funding of RTE in Ireland, and indeed those recommendations have not been taken up. Some of our members are more involved in the financial supervision of regulators, and, for example, in the case of Poland, is actually setting the budget.
Let's move to the case of Poland then. We have Krystyna Rozgoni, who is working on these issues when talking about the challenges that public service media experiences, governance and independence. Often reference is made to Poland and Hungary. We have done that here too. How would you describe the situation in these two countries? Are the European Council of Europe standards, are they being respected there or not? Can you say that clearly?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So I would suggest that when we talk about independence and guarantees safeguards of independence of public service media, we should definitely consider the duality, so to say, of matters of theory and of practice. In theory, the legal safeguards and the norms aimed at protecting the independence of PSM, let's say the de jure independence, we have frameworks, we have standards, we have strong norms, so to say, and on the other hand, we have the de facto, the praxis. So on the legal side, at the European level, we have the Council of Europe, especially the standards, as I mentioned, but we also have the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, both of which are founded in the Article 10 framework of the European Convention of Human Rights. Again, on the European level, European Union level, I would wish to mention here, because we are going to discuss this also in more details today. We have the recently adopted draft European Media Freedom Act we need to discuss here, because that puts forward binding proposals with regards to the independence of public service media. The EU's legal competencies are much more restricted to internal market affairs, so to say, and to some extent are also encaptured within the fundamental charts and the rights enshrined by the Fundamental Rights Charter of the EU. So this is what we have. However, PSM, public service media, is regulated basically on a national level. It's a state affair, so to say. And this is for many reasons, for historical reasons, for political reasons, for cultural reasons. We are not here to discuss that, but this is what we have now. So when we are addressing the issue of Hungary or Poland or any other countries, we need to be firm about that whatever is happening, it's mostly regulated on the national level. So let's see what is happening. And I am here, I will be very briefly quoting the latest results, so, and the latest findings of the rule of law reports of the European Union and the Medium Pluralism Monitor 2020 with regards to these two countries. So in Poland, it says concerns over the independence of public service media remain, including over safeguards for appointment to executive positions. There are high risks with regards to governance and funding. And the management is, the media management is, there are signs of growing political partisanship and opaqueness about funding. So this is what these European monitors and reports are saying. What about Hungary? Hungary, public service media operates within a complex institutional system amidst concerns over its financial editorial independence. There is a high risk and the lack of transparency, severe control, and oversight over the budget of the public service broadcaster, and a lot of concerns about editorial independence and amplifying disinformation by third actors.
Okay, but if we have that information, if we have those conclusions in which risks are included, what happens with that sort of a conclusion?
What happens? That's basically not much, I would say. And here we come back to the vicious circle, to the starting point that this is a national matter. But to understand why is nothing happening, we also need to consider where are these attacks against the independence of the public service media? What is the context they are happening within? And here I would recommend us to remember and to use the framework of media capture. And if we use this framework, we will see that these are not individual problems. And these are not problems of certain problematic Eastern European countries, because what is media capture about? Regulatory capture, and I'm looking around this room, and if I would ask you how many countries would say that the regulators in their particular countries are not independent but captured either by economic interest or political interest, there would be many to raise hands. Use of state financing as a control tool. So using typically, for example, state advertisements to control the media. So-called soft censorship. Again, if I would look around, there will be many to say that this sounds very familiar. Ownership takeover. And the fourth is control over public service media. So this is systemic. This is structural, and it's not a one-off problem of troubled Eastern European countries.
But it's still bigger than in the rest of the countries. We cannot say that in Hungary and Poland, problems of independence of public service media they are much bigger than anywhere else. Can we say that or not?
We can say that. and we should say that, obviously. Again, there are very limited powers of any other institutions outside of these countries to do anything against that. So when we will come back to the question whether European Union's attempts and the draft European Media Freedom Act is going to be a solution to these problems, I would say I have highly doubts, but we do see attempts to overcome the problem of national level regulations.
Okay, we will be able to touch upon that Media Freedom Act a bit later. We can also talk about other instruments, and that's important that you mentioned that now. Let's move to another example. Lithuania is a very interesting example because at a certain point it experienced attempts by politicians to change the law, basically, of LRT, and it was threat to independence, but because of huge public outcry and I would say pressure of international institutions, LRT managed to save the current governance model that it already has. Vytautas Juozapaitis is a member of parliament who was in the opposition at the time when things happened, right? It was 2018, a ruling majority of the parliament set up a special commission to investigate financial and economic activities of the public broadcaster of Lithuania. That's the gist of the situation. And we have managed to guarantee editorial independence and institutional autonomy. Mr. Vytautas, what would you say, what are the key elements that you managed to save and maybe strengthen by the new LRT law?
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Well, I don't have anything to add to what you told, because you told everything I was prepared, you know. So, well, it's not so dramatic. I mean, it was not a real fight or like war, but in political world, it happens all the times. I'm very sorry because I'm looking at my phone. I'm not playing, you know, so many games, but I'm sitting here on the standby mode, and I'm ready to go to the parliamentarian session, because today it's very, very important day. We're going through a new budget for the next year. So we're voting in a couple minutes. So if I leave, you know, without saying goodbye, I'm so sorry.
But don't forget to leave a big chunk for the Lithuanian public broadcaster.
Well, that I want to say, because, you know, Lithuanian television and radio, LRT, budget, it doesn't, I mean, it directly depends on the excise taxes, you know.
Shares.
Yeah, calculating in the you know, from the previous year, not the last year, but the previous year. So it doesn't matter what we're counting, you know, for the budget, but for LRT it's fixed. I mean, you will get more and more, and it depends how much alcohol we drink and how much gas we use, you know. So we are safe, you know. Yes, in the last, as you mentioned, in the last term of the Parliament, there is a majority which is now in opposition. What it happens sometimes in political, you know, life. They tried to have. You know, control of LRT, and they started the investigation commission and so on and so on. But we have also in Lithuania constitutional court. This is like, you know, the highest, you know, position has in Lithuania, and they announced that this issue, it was, you know, it was not. It was not able to function constitutionally. So it finished. This war finished just in the beginning. So they started. Of course, it was much you know. In public, you know, the discussions and so on, but I think now we are in the good position and in the good level. We agree, including the opposition, that public service media must be paid, you know, by state. but politicians and parliament, we are not going to inside of this organization. I mean, we are not controlling any issues what's going on inside. So because we have. Regarding the management of the independent public broadcaster, it's important to know that the council of 12 members, delegated by various organizations, has been created for this purpose. And also, it's important to know that the beginning of the term of every single, member of this. Council the starts in different times, so it means that the council works every time that there is no any break. So it's the same system is with our constitutional court. Every 7 years they are changing, but not on the same time.
So they are not changing when the government is changing, right?
Absolutely right. So that's the previous government. I mean, not government, but the majority of Seimas. They tried to make it, that the council of LRT would change together with politician, with the election, So this is impossible. So we have now very safe system, and if you have to change now, you need to make a revolution. So that is possible theoretically, but I think it's not possible in practice.
But when you say that it wasn't that dramatic, it wasn't like a war, I wouldn't maybe say so. I mean, from the public broadcaster's perspective, it felt like there was a big threat, and the Director General of the LRT was, writing all of these letters to the EBU, to the Council of Europe, raising the debates everywhere she could. And it felt as if the then, majority of Seimas didn't really like that international pressure. Would you disagree with that?
Well, it depends on the experience, So I'm from the opera world, and I have my skin very, very, thick, So, in every position or every situation, you can see that this is the end of the world. Yeah, it's just you need to be very precise and to make things what you need to make. So, and I think that the general manager of LRT, the new one, because this pressure started earlier, yes, and that was the case. Why that started so. But I think that we made good. I mean, so if you need any advices for your country, so you can always write. We'll write down the instruction how to.
Okay, but we still have to dwell on that instruction for a little bit. What do you think was there that worked? What do you think was there that saved the Lithuanian public broadcaster from threats?
I think that was very good. I mean, the power. Power? It's soft power from EBU and all those organizations that they wrote to our parliaments. And it made a huge impression for those guys who has no idea what it is, EBU.
Okay, that is very interesting, Mr. Jozapaitis, because you're saying that this was very important, while we have heard Christina say that there's limited power of other institutions to do anything, and maybe that's a good chance to ask Maria, what about the actual power, the ability of institutions to do anything in situations like the one Lithuania had and the one Hungary and Poland is experiencing? What is the actual power of international institutions to do anything?
Thank you. I'm really glad that you came to me, because I did kind of want to respond to a few of those points. A couple of points I would make. So first of all, what's clear, I think, is that, and this is also, a reflection on what Tim Davies said, is that yes, arguably it doesn't matter, let's say, what the financing model is or what the governance model is, as long as safeguards are built in for independence. And that's the really critical bit. The safeguards have to be built in, and those safeguards have to be enforceable. Now, my argument would be that one of those safeguards is an independent regulator as an oversight body, but you also need safeguards to build in the independence of that regulator too. So, there's a few things I think which we have potentially to use in this regard, but maybe are not being used as much as they could be. One of those is in the case of regulators, the existing provisions in the Audiovisual Media Services Directive for the independence of regulators. There have been questions, I think, several times asked of the European Commission as to why no particular actions have been taken in relation to the introduction of those new provisions in the 2018 revision of the directive. And the answer has come in various reasonable ways in relation to, for example, well, we dealt with it in the rule of law report, or not all countries have transposed yet, and so we're going to get to it. So I'm very hopeful that that will be the case, but that is an enforcement mechanism. And then, of course, as Christine already mentioned, and as I understand you already discussed this morning, the Media Freedom Act introduces additional safeguards both for the resourcing and independence of regulators, but also, of course, these provisions about the independence of public service media. How they will be enforced? Well, it's an interesting question, because although I'm representing here EPRA, we, of course, work very closely with our sister organization, ERGA, which is in the Media Freedom Act significantly expanded and given additional new powers. The board will doubtless have some kind of role to play in relation to a number of the Media Freedom Act provisions. But the Media Freedom Act does give national regulators oversight and over monitoring compliance with these provisions about independence. So we will have to see how that is, how that plays out in practice. But certainly there are building blocks. They can be used more effectively, and I think that's perhaps something that could be developed in the coming months and years.
Okay, we can still discuss that further on. Thank you, Maria, for your contribution. I hope you do stay with us for the rest of the panel. But I want to finally move to Megan now and talk a little bit about elections. We have heard about public broadcaster and public broadcasters being more relevant during the times of crisis, during the times of war, be it, also Queen's funeral or whatever, anything that is crucially important. They do become more relevant during the elections too, right? How is the elections coverage? How is that an indicator of the state freedom, state of media freedom in a particular country?
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation to be here. I think elections present a clear opportunity for looking critically at the status of public media in the country where the elections are taking place. I think that's probably why I was invited to join this panel today, which I'm grateful for. It prevents an opportunity for both the public media to demonstrate their independence and to demonstrate their ability to provide balanced, critical coverage of the contestants and those participating in the elections. It presents an opportunity for voters to evaluate and question their own trust in the public media as they're learning about the candidates and the contestants, and they're seeing how the government is being covered in the news coverage. But it's also an opportunity to have an independent assessment of the status of the media and the public media. And that's what we do when we observe the elections, and why we look at the status of the media landscape, and the media environment in an election process, and why we include that as part of our observation. And OSCE states have mandated us to include it because media is an important democratic institution that has a concrete role to play in the elections. And just like a court or election management body, we have to look at public trust in that body, in that institution, and independence of that institution. So we do look and we provide, and so do a lot of citizen organizations when they observe elections, provide a critical analysis of the impact of that independence or the compromises to the independence on the impact of funding, impact of how the public media are appointed and how they work and in coverage. And I just would also note, we also look at the regulator and the independence of the regulator in that case as well.
So would you say maybe what are the best working examples in Europe? What are the countries, because you monitor and you file reports, are there countries that are more independent than others if you look at the election coverage procedure?
Well, I think it's, to go back to what Mr. Davey mentioned at the beginning, he said it's not so political. I would say that across the Council of Europe region, which are all member states of the OSCE as well, it is quite political in many cases. And there are political ways of ruling powers or those in power influencing, either directly putting pressure on the public media service or on the opposite end. Mr. Davey mentioned the need to have the audience, and Christina mentioned the role of government advertising, and therefore they can, quite to the contrary, eliminate competition for the public media if they see the public media is working in their benefit. As for how the public media is doing in our observations, across the board, during an election process, public media also have additional responsibilities and frequently are asked to give airtime to candidates and contestants and parties, and asked to organize debates, and asked to provide equal time to the contestants. Across the board, states, the public media and where we observe, they meet those requirements in terms of the additional requirements for elections. Where we see problems, though, is in their news coverage and their editorial coverage. And there we see more coverage of government and ruling party figures, and that are also running in the election, and that gives them an unfair advantage.
You have talked about the independence of regulators. You said that you monitor that, and Maria mentioned that this is very important too. Would you single out any most important challenges there?
There, we look not just at their independence, so their structure, how they're appointed, and how they are funded as well. But we also look at their effectiveness and whether or not they are doing the monitoring that's actually needed in order to enforce the rules, both the rules for general media practices and the election-specific rules. Often regulators are also a forum for election-related complaints or grievances, so we would look at them in that case as well. And it was mentioned today, starting from the very beginning, the stability, and that is one of the good practices, is having, just like a court of law needs to have security of tenure and making sure that the regulator is not influenced by shifts in political powers. That is one of the good practices I would highlight.
Christina, I want to move back to you now and go back to this debate about the international instruments, because we have heard from the Lithuanian case that, international instruments do work in a sense. And then we have had Maria, who has mentioned some other instruments that potentially could be used, like audiovisual services directive, which I understand is the European level, because not the Council of Europe area, which is a wider one, right? Yeah. You have said already that you don't think that the Media Freedom Act, you don't have high hopes for it. But what about the rest of these instruments that have been mentioned?
So first, just to make clear, what I was talking were legal instruments. So the pressure by the EBU, I would call a political instrument, a very important one, a super important one. Pressure and monitoring and the comments. We had today with us the representative for media freedom of the OSCE. Whatever she is saying, whatever she is stating about a concerning situation, or the Council of Europe's commissioner, these are very, very important signals and international instruments in that sense. However, unfortunately, the legal instruments are very limited. Maria mentioned the AVMSD and the regulators. That is only concerned on EU level, but then implemented on national level about the independence of the regulators who, in 50% of the cases do have some regulatory competence over the public service broadcaster, like, for example, the assessment of fulfilling the remit or meeting the criteria of European works in their production. So these kind of things. But there is no super court, neither on European level nor on international level. And me being a Hungarian citizen, me being someone who truly believed in having, how to say, having faith that there is something bigger out of the country, I have already had to leave because of these reasons, because of the systemic attacks on media freedom and everything I personally but also professionally believed in. It was a very bittering experience to realize that it's not there. And I really would wish to alert all of us, do not wait for some miracle to happen. We have to fight our fights within our countries. We have to safeguard our public service media broadcasters within our countries. Do not wait for anyone else to do this job instead of you or for you.
But still, you're saying that there should be a super court, right? And I want to turn to Manuel and say, should there be a super court? Or in other words, would you agree that legal instruments are very limited in terms of guaranteeing independence and solving the problems that we are talking about today?
I mean, they are limited, and it's kind of an irony. For years, nation states tried to keep the EU out of media policy as much as possible, and now suddenly that some governments don't take freedom of expression, media freedom that seriously, we hope for an EU solution, right? But we have to be aware that the EU has very limited responsibility for media freedom and media pluralism. The EMFA is based on the functioning of the internal market, and safeguarding an internal market is something different from safeguarding a public sphere that is working. So, and we have to be conscious of that. So the EU cannot solve this situation. Best case, they have some more safeguards in there. They help national governments and national civil society organizations in safeguarding the independence of media. But the EU cannot harmonize in that area. It doesn't have the power to do that. And nation states never wanted it to have the power. So I agree, nation states have to solve this. But this is also why I think the Council of Europe will remain so important in this area. Not only for the judges at the European Court of Human Rights, but also for national organizations, so that they can pinpoint to recommendations by the Council of Europe and make their national governments at least acknowledge what they are doing. And
but are the recommendations enough? Yes, there are recommendations, but if they don't become obligatory, there's, space for the countries to not obey them. Ignore them.
Well, the problem we have, but recommendations are soft law, but we shouldn't discard them. I think, as Christina said, it's the responsibility in each and every nation state of democratic processes to defend democracy, to defend media freedom, to defend fundamental freedoms and human rights. And I just want to point out one of the most recent recommendations of the Council of Europe on principles of media and communication governance. Because what makes this so interesting is that it tries to take stock of what was done before, in the decades before, of reaffirming important aspects there and of updating them to the digital world. And public service media is strongly featured also in this new recommendation, saying we need independent public service media, operational autonomy, sufficient funding, but also transparency of the funding mechanisms and a convergent remit of public service media. But it also calls out public service media themselves, that they need to make sure that the public participates in internal governance mechanisms and that vulnerable groups of society are also represented. So I think these recommendations are very valuable for nation states to discuss the future of public service media.
Megan, you wanted to jump in.
I just wanted to jump in on the topic of recommendations. OSCE and ODIHR specifically in our election observation makes a number of recommendations. That's our main product. And they're specific to the country where we're observing the election process, and they are included on all aspects of the process, including the media. But we face the same challenge. They are not legally binding. They are politically binding. And they are, we're an assessment of whether or not the state met their commitments and met international standards. But it all comes down to, the implementation comes down to the political will of those in the country and their ability to amend the legislation and reach that reform. What we can do is highlight the resources that are there to help them do that and provide the recommendations for the use by civil society or by the media as well in their reporting on our assessment and reporting on the work of the parliamentarians then to address the legal changes that are needed.
Christina, you wanted to jump in really briefly as well.
Joining what Manuel and also Megan said, democratic backsliding is not happening one day after to the other. It's a process. In the case of Hungary, it took 12 years to get to a status where, I would say, beyond repair. In this process, recommendations, what the international community is doing, the Council of Europe is doing, is extremely important because you still have certain mechanisms that are working, that are functioning. And these certain mechanisms, the courts, civil society, international observers, they do need these standards, they do need these recommendations to say that against which it's not acceptable what is happening.
Morgens, I wanted to ask you, we have heard Christina say something very important, that we don't need to wait for something to happen. We need to sort of safeguard the public service media for ourselves in our countries. And we have heard other speakers also mentioning that a lot depends on a specific country. But still, given there is a lack of legal instruments, the recommendations are super important, as we hear. Do parliamentarians of the Assembly, for example, bring the debate which is carried out in the Council of Europe context back to their home countries?
Well, I think we have a weakness there, not only when it comes to recommendations, resolutions that we do on media, but also in other areas, that we have the problem that a lot of national parliamentarians do not know what the Council of Europe is, or even the Parliamentary Assembly. That's for true. And even you also have the problem that the delegations, and I'm myself part of the Danish delegation, do not efficiently enough bring the results back.
Why?
Simply because it's difficult. It's difficult to bring interest to your national parliament colleagues on items which they don't are thinking about in their daily life. They work with lots of other things.
But would you say that it's always difficult, or is it only difficult when there are other more important issues happening country-wise?
No, it's generally difficult. Also because that people know that the Council of Europe decisions, unless you have a convention, is not legally binding. So it's not that. But actually, I would say, and we have to improve our work on that in each delegation, and perhaps also in the Parliamentary Assembly, discussing how to be better to have this implemented at the national parliaments. But actually, I know, and that's why I agree what has been said, that it means something. A lot of NGOs, a lot of people fighting for different areas of democracy and so on, they use our resolutions. They use our recommendations in order to improve the situation in their different countries. So it is very important that they are there. But we as parliamentarians could be much better in actually doing the work of interesting our colleagues more for what is happening in the Council of Europe. One thing that I often have, and I've worked with media for many years, have been very stunned about, is that in many other areas you have a strong consumer structure or kind of movement structure when it comes to climate, when it comes to education, when it comes to you have a lot of interest groups who are also from the bottom in their countries trying to fight for this and that. I don't see that in any country, any consumer organization or structure fighting for good media.
Are you saying that the citizens don't care about what they see on TV and what they hear on the radio? That is the problem.
Yeah, I think it's stunning. Neither in my own country we have any structure where people demand to have a good quality television or good quality content. In older days, in my organization belonging to the political parties, actually we had structures working with the media, the right for the access to radio and television and so on. It's not there anymore. Actually, one should work in order to have a stronger consumer kind of structure organization on this. That would also help. It's not only about politicians doing things, but I agree that not everything in detail that's to media and that's to other stuff should be decided in international areas or European structures, but the fundamental things should be laid out in binding conventions or in binding agreements, like also the Media Freedom Act. But I also think we should be careful of just thinking, okay, as long as it is something that has been discussed or decided in an international or European organization, then this is the truth. Unfortunately, we have seen in the UN on a lot of areas when it comes to, for example, women's rights and so on, that it has gone backwards when not having the values that we think are the European, they can overrule those things, for example, in the UN. So that could also happen perhaps in Europe.
Yes, we have seen that with Russia. Let's name things right. Christina, you wanted to add it.
Taking further Morgan's concern about that you don't see the consumers fighting for good media. In the morning, we had the excellent example that public service media is like ambulance. We need it when it's really burning. Public service media or fights for public service media, the latest example I could recall was when it was really burning and when in Greece, after the financial economic crisis, the Greek public broadcaster was shut down. And that was the moment when people went on the streets. It really has to hurt. On the other hand, in countries, especially with post-communist memories, it's always and first the public service broadcaster to occupy in terms of crisis situations, in times of war or these kinds. So put on fire, like, really, and to go there, it also has this symbolic. So I don't think there is no connection with the consumer, with the audiences, but it's more complicated than that. I totally agree with that.
Let's turn to Maria now. We have had some interesting ideas about a stronger consumer pressure needed, right? About maybe not everything should be discussed on the international level, but on the international level, there's not a lot legally binding. There are recommendations, right, and there are instruments that exist, but they don't force countries to obey any sort of rules. And you have mentioned already some of the instruments that might become more used and that could be more instrumental in this. But isn't there something else that is still missing, like a high-level ministerial meeting that should be regular and should discuss these issues and raise them to a higher level? Maria.
Thank you. I mean, it's definitely not for me to start making recommendations about how ministers should behave, but I do have a couple of points to make here. I think what was really interesting, I also wanted to come back on Morgan's point about the lack of any kind of groundswell of support for free and independent media, and this point about we see support when everything's on fire. I think that those public service broadcasters who are operating in what might be considered to be a stable environment do have a responsibility, assuming and understanding that risk is not. There are possible risks for all kinds of countries, not just East European countries, as was mentioned. They have a responsibility to foster that kind of belief in, understanding of, and support of what the benefits and the value of public service media is. Some public service broadcasters do this more than others, but I think that's really important, and just to bring that back to the point that Manuel made as well, and the recommendations which I also worked on. From the Council of Europe on media and communications governance, stress the role and the responsibilities of the broadcasters themselves, of the media companies themselves, and that's where I would come in. It's almost a media literacy point. It's almost a kind of, what is the responsibility of quality journalism to make itself known and to explain to people what the difference is between trustworthy content, quality content, and that which isn't. And I think the media themselves play a huge responsibility there. And while they are able to do so, that they should take that role. The usefulness of Council of Europe instruments as well, I would also say, I would just underline, they're very useful for regulators. The detail that's in them can be substantially used by regulators in their day-to-day work. I certainly promote that within Ofcom, and I know that many of my colleagues in other regulators do so also. So I definitely wouldn't underestimate the kind of working level impact that has, and also in particular for those people who are working in those regulators, which may be experiencing challenges at any given point. The working level people have strong values and strong needs for support, and those recommendations offer that kind of support as well. And then you mentioned, what can be done at that kind of more international level. Yes, I'm sure, meetings and some ministerial level discussions and commitments are helpful. I think the Council of Europe bears a responsibility to, as Morgan said, to promote its work more at the national level, to monitor the implementation of its recommendations. I know it does some of that work, but I can't believe that more couldn't be done in that regard. Having worked on several of them, as I know many of the other panel have, it would be really helpful, I think, for us to revisit and to see what's actually happened and how have those recommendations been implemented. Because monitoring, as we know in this sphere, and as Megan said, is incredibly important in terms of soft compliance and transparency and bringing attention to areas that need that attention.
Thank you.
So I would also say that.
Thank you. Manuel, would you agree that there isn't enough monitoring?
I think what I would like to respond to from Maria is the reminder that it's also about Western Europe. We heard it already this morning, East versus West. It's a problem all over Europe that public service media is under threat. And there are two sources of threats. One is commercial media, mainly newspaper publishers, because their business models are crumbling as users and advertising are shifting to platforms. So they think pressuring media policymakers to restrict the remit or the funding of public service media will help them in their difficult situation, although there is no evidence existing that it really helps them if that would happen. But there is also another threat, and this is populist governments and parties that attack public service media, try to abolish public funding.
Let's talk examples. Is it Denmark that would come to your mind first? Is it Switzerland? Is it France?
Well, there are many examples coming from Switzerland. I'll bring one that most of you are familiar with. 4 years ago, we had a popular vote, the No Billag initiative, that wanted to abolish public funding altogether. And these were not fringe actors coming forward with the proposal. It was supported by the biggest Swiss party, the right-wing People's Party. It was supported by the Swiss Small Business Association. And they were not successful because voters saw that this would be the end of public service media. They rejected it with a majority of over 70%. But the next initiative is already on the horizon, and it seems less extreme. It only wants to cut the budget into half, but this will be the end of public service media as we know it in Switzerland. And it's not the only country. Denmark, when it moved from license fee funding to tax funding, the then government tried to cut the budget by 20%. President Macron in France just decided that it's a good idea to abolish the license fee without having a new model in place. The various Tory governments that were in power over this year in the UK think about privatizing Channel 4. They think about replacing the license fee. And this constant pressure on the funding, this constant pressure that budget might be diminishing, this has an imprint on managers of public service media. It has an imprint on editorial departments. Scholars in the UK are complaining that the BBC is too establishment-oriented, that it goes too easy on the conservative government because they want to appease government and avoid a budget cut. So these are dangerous developments.
But is there a solution to that? Because it sounds like there isn't, because the threat of populist governments, that is a huge topic on, in Europe, at least in general, and it has to do with the polarization of societies and things that, we cannot, as public service media sector, we cannot really control. Or is there a solution?
There is no solution for public service media or the media sector alone. As you say, these are deeper, bigger societal developments, and we discussed this also this morning, that we have all these underlying polarization processes going on in Europe. So these are challenges for democracies, really. And I also don't think that having a discussion about public service media is bad. I think it's a good thing. We have to think of public service media as a relationship to society. So we have to renegotiate the remit, the level of funding every once in a while. Otherwise, these organizations lose their relevance, they lose their legitimacy in the population. So this is important to do, but it has to be within a democratic framework that these discussions happen, and obviously not all political actors are interested in finding solutions.
It's very important what you have just said now. Christina, you wanted to pick up on that.
Responsibility of quality media other than public service media would definitely highlight. We are in a moment when quality media has to acknowledge that the biggest enemy is not public service media taking away money from them, but it's platforms, but it's platformized advertising. I am frightened to see, for example, in the country I live in Austria, how quality media is joining forces with populist politicians attacking the financing of public service media. This is simply wrong. And this is something where responsibility of quality media outlets, I would definitely highlight that there was a game change in that sense.
There is one other aspect that we want to discuss. I have seen that you wanted to jump in, and we will do that just in a second. But the purpose of this panel is not just to look for solutions, because this will be done in the panel further on, but also to sort of set the stage and see the issues and see how important and how big they are. And I want to go back to Megan, because when we talk about elections, there is this elephant in the room about these free time rules, where some broadcasters have, and they complain about them. There are huge discussions in countries where you have parties that get obligatory time, and then they get airtime, and if they don't get a second the exact second like the previous one, then they get angry and so on. The consumers don't really like to watch that, because it's always, normally at least, it's very boring. How effective is this election coverage system, and are there discussions in certain countries to change that? Are there good examples, innovative solutions to this?
Well, yes, and you and I briefly exchanged on this earlier. There are additional in the vast majority of Council of Europe countries, there are additional requirements put on the public media during an election period. It can include, as you mentioned, free airtime for contestants. It can include requirements to organize certain debates and at different levels, or it can include just advertising requirements that are also applicable to private media. The question you posed to me is, does there come a time when it's unproductive to require these because it no longer attracts any interest of the audience? And there are some cases where it has, and you raised concerns about this in Lithuania, and I understand that it's been now changed in Lithuania for local elections at least, but maybe it's still a concern for national elections. If you have requirements to air free airtime for candidates in prime time and all candidates on an equal basis, then you do risk then losing the interest of the audience and not having an effective programming, and therefore defeating the purpose of informing the citizens about the contestants. We looked at this in Moldova just recently and providing a legal opinion for them on their election code and about the this balance that you need to find between providing that information and treating contestants equally. The most common solutions that legislators have found is that they allow for some proportional allocation, some allocation that depends on support in parliament or in polling, and they allow for then smaller parties or those without as much demonstrated support being covered in non-prime time, or they allow for polling or selection of parliamentary parties for debates, and organizing separate debates for smaller parties. Solutions like that. But it is a difficult question because it's also equal treatment of the candidates. And the parties that are contesting in the election.
It is an interesting topic. We could go into that deeper, but I think we are coming to an end, and there is a need to see if maybe there are people in the audience who would like to raise their concerns, who would like to ask questions, who would like to make comments. It is also possible for online viewers to do it online on Zoom. If you have anything that matters to you at this very moment, we still have several minutes, and we can still address the issues that are of concern to you. I do not see any hands raised. Does anybody? Yes, Mr. Zingeris, you've got your microphone and you know how to use it. Mr. Zingeris is in the Parliamentary Assembly as well, the Lithuanian parliamentarian. There is a microphone that is installed into this, but if that's not okay, we might find you a different one. Yes, and then when you're seated, I think it's easiest to use it.
Just fish out, okay.
Yes, because otherwise you would not have to speak very loud.
Yes, I see here among in the circle of friends, especially in the Council of Europe Parliamentary Assembly, such pleasure to welcome you in Vilnius, especially yesterday you have fruitful session in our parliament discussing rapporteurships, the two rapporteurships by Mr. Schenach and Mr. Jensen. Thank you for your deep insights, and thank you for staff of subcommittee for working together for those two reports. Today, of course, my question is related to very sensitive topic. During the last 32 years of our vendor side for our independence time, and from the 90s, we come to the top level of free market society when yellow press, yellow news, bold news become firm first reality in our countries, and public services like yours and this conference supporting an idea of real legitimate existence of public services in member countries of Council of Europe, 46 countries. We successfully exclude Russia just during last sessions and have resolution about Putin voted in favor for unanimously for Putin regime like a terrorist one. Talking about public services, and state support. And envy guys from outside attacking, just mentioned by you, attacking through the even solid newspapers, attacking public services and existence of public services. Don't we see the dictated by social media bolden topics and degradations of our real societies being in the ocean of yellow waves of information, and only public media, they have patience to be on unpopular but so extremely important human rights side, issue related to human rights, sexual rights, Istanbul Convention, and other issues who are related to cementing European network of values. So the set of values, cemented, set of values of Europe cemented by public services. So we should, in our speeches and in our recommendations in Council of Europe, we should be rightly said, not only recommendations, but more firmly implemented by the national parliaments. We should be more on the side of unpopular educational and cultural heritage issue, even if it goes to the Second World War, to Holocaust, to human rights, to other issues. So I would like to recommend you, well, I'm in Council of Europe from '93. I was youngest member, now become not so young after 30 years of serving in Council of Europe, to say that your reports should be available on the table in European Parliament, in OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, even in NATO Parliamentary Assembly, and should be distributed. And of course, we should have the implementation, just mentioned by the anchor, implementation of those resolutions immediately done by our national parliaments, not looking of the agenda and competition among items. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Zingeris. Some of the things that were mentioned, they are all really important, but one of the media-related issue could be the yellow press, as far as I understand. We heard Tim Davies saying that we don't need, unpopular production. We want the media to be watched by everybody, 90% of the people. But we hear Mr. Zingeris saying, just to put it very simply, that in the world of a lot of yellow press, it's the public broadcaster that should find the courage to be unpopular and uninteresting. Would anyone comment on that? Yes, Mr. Muggins.
Well, I think this is very important because I totally agree with my friend Mr. Zingeris on that. Of course, public service, we have high expectations for quality. We also have high expectations for public service covering areas that are not very popular, like different kind of art and other stuff that is perhaps most for a smaller part of the population. And they should cover this area, but they also should cover the broader content for the broader audience on high quality level. And that's important, both to create what also Mr. Davies said, a place for us all to be together. And we need that in today's society, a place where we can experience things and afterwards have dialogue together. And I think perhaps it's not possible to come back to that world, but we can try. And the national public institutions, public service institutions are very important platforms for that. And on the other side, the public service have in their task to produce news for everybody, not only national news, also local news. That is not for a commercial player to do, perhaps. So the role of public service is very important, but it has to be a public service that is for everybody, and you have to try to reach out for everybody.
Manuel, is there a space for public service broadcasting, for production that is maybe uninteresting, but important? Is there a space for that production in public service media?
Definitely, and it has to do that, obviously, because not all commercial media will be able to do that and willing to do that. I wouldn't write off private media completely in that sense. A lot of them on the local level are doing great work, also covering political decision-making, local elites that nobody else can cover. But I think this question about the remit of public service media really needs to also move beyond just talking about content. I think we can all agree, and it's a no-brainer to say a convergent remit is necessary. If it's only linear radio, television, then it has no future, period. But we also have to think about creating new public spaces for discussion, using new technologies. Now that Mr. Musk was buying Twitter, suddenly the Fediverse and Mastodon got a lot of attention. So why not have public service media creating Mastodon instances for people in their nation states, having a public, safe space for discussion? Why not talk more about collaboration with other non-profit institutions like museums, academia, libraries, and so on, and not just talk about content production? And why not talk more about content co-creation with audiences to have them participate more and not just being consumers of media content? So there are ways to rethink what a public service can be in the digital world.
I think we are about to wrap up. A final comment from everyone. You, Mr. Jozapaitis, have been looking at your phone because there is a budgetary procedure at the Parliament. But what is your final recommendation for all of the colleagues in the Council of Europe area when they're faced with a situation like the Lithuanian public broadcaster had? What is your recommendation for the others? What should they do?
Well, I think after 50 years of occupation here by Russians, by Bolsheviks, we have a little bit more experience, and well, we feel, with bodies and with our blood, what it is to have a really free and public service media, and I feel personally, but I think that I'm right, because in Lithuania we only party, Homeland Union, who were warning our citizens and the whole Europe that fascistic Russia one day will start again, make those things what they are doing and thinking all the historical times. Doesn't depend which kind. It was Tsar or something, or Bolshevik, Soviet Union or independent Russia. So I think that many issues and many things we are talking about, they were produced by this country. They tried to mix our brains, and even we don't understand this. And especially in the western part of Europe, So we are also in the western part of Europe, of course, if you see from this, from the east. But our mentality, we can get, all those things in one place, And in the western part, it's different. And also talking about Poland and Hungary, it's also a different situation, because in the historical time it was not really occupied, but informally, but the brains also were damaged. So now we are trying to get through this illness, and it is very important to understand that the independent public service media, we need it like a fresh air, because otherwise we'll die, And I think that we are doing good, even if we speak about those examples like from the past, parliamentary term, that we're trying to kill, free media. But even now, also we have a big pressure from I mean, not we, but also, and we, but independent media from other side that we call, private media. And yesterday I was talking to somebody from the guests. They were speaking about this situation and this problem that it's everywhere. If government supports, public media, there is some jealousy, so from this side. But I think we'll go through this, and we have a good experience. We have already around 12 years this supporting the public media, and it's 12 years. It's already experience, and recommendations we have. We can write it down just step by step, but. The main important thing now to understand that the main enemy of our brains are, coming from the east, from Russia, and this is kind of soft power, that we not always do as much attention as we need. So, and this is very important that we should have media who would connect us, but not to destroy the societies.
Okay, so keep on doing your work. Do not forget the Lithuanian public broadcaster. Just very briefly, Maria, governance, funding and remit, this is what we are discussing today. Yes, you have to go. We understand that. Thank you so much. Let's give you a big round of applause. To wrap up, is there anything else that we have not mentioned to implement the Council of Europe standards better? What else could we do? I think Maria is no longer with us. Would anyone, Megan, you would want to take
I just wanted to say, Maria added to the discussion the topic of disinformation, and we also heard from the floor the topic of disinformation. We all know disinformation is an important issue in election processes, particularly following certain elections in my own country. And the public turned towards the public media for credible information and reliable information in elections, but in other circumstances too. We saw this in COVID times as well. But the role of media in elections to provide credible information and critical coverage, because it's not just about information, but it's also about critical coverage, is only as valuable as they are perceived to be independent. And anything that compromises their perception of independence takes away from this value that they're adding.
Thank you so much. I think we will stop here because all of the solutions will be discussed in the third panel, which is still awaiting. There is a lot of content to be discussed. The Media Freedom Act will also extensively be discussed there. And I would like to ask everybody to give a very big round of applause to all of the participants of the discussion here. Thank you so much. And Elise, back to you.
And thank you, Živile, for an excellent panel. Thank you so much to all of you. Ladies and gentlemen, public service media as an agora is what I take away from what was said this morning, not to be a fairground where everybody goes to just forget all the worries and woes. You can at public service media too, but there's more to be had, exchanges of ideas and thoughts, working together, collaborate, dare to be unpopular and more educational. Just a couple of thoughts that stay with me, apart from all the other things you discussed in terms of financing, in terms of legal instruments to coordinate and implement oversight systems and taking responsibility, building on the themes we discussed this morning. And, ladies and gentlemen, we will take all of that one more step forward in the last panel discussion after the coffee break. Yes, there's going to be a coffee break. Right now, you can get up, stretch your legs again, move those shoulders, shake the head, make the blood flow. Think about what has been said here. Enjoy the discussions amongst yourselves, and we love to see you back at 4. And that goes for you online as well, of course. See you in little over half an hour. Thank you.